It was my senior year in college at a conservative Christian college in which I was a Earth studies major, geology major, studying the Earth, in which I finally took a class in which I learned how to read and write. It's questionable as to whether I've retained much of that. You can be the judge. But I remember it was called African Literature, and it was a profound gift of a class. But there I was introduced to the many literary giants, including Chinua Achebe, who wrote that first debut novel in 1958, Things Fall Apart. This novel helped me understand that toxic mix of colonialism embodied in missionary zeal, corporate greed, and white supremacy, and how the deep traditions embedded in a local Nigerian culture seemingly fall apart so tragically in the face of such systemic sins. Achebe, of course, is quoting, which I did not know until I read it, W.B. Yeats' poem, The Second Coming, which goes, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart. The center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Yeats wrote this poem in 1919 at the aftermath of the so-called Great War, but it was also in the face of the 1918-1919 global Spanish flu pandemic, in which his pregnant wife, Georgie, became gravely ill and nearly died. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold passionate intensity. These, of course, feel like apt descriptions of our nation this past week and a half. Words fall short as things fall apart. And as if to underscore the weight and intensity of what we have been facing, Tuesday morning this week, a square-foot-sized rock fell apart off of the face of our beloved 237-foot Richard Upjohn steeple and crashed to the Berkeley Street sidewalk near the corner of Newbury. This is not fiction. Miraculously, no one was hurt or worse. Minutes before this, Women's Lunch Place guests had been lingering in that area. A day before that, Adam, Bill, and I, Chuck, Fred, and others had been walking around there. A day and a half before that, hundreds of prophetic protesters had passed and streamed past that very spot. Miraculous, no one was hurt. And miraculous, we have an incredible guru to our building named Bill Brown, par excellence, who is managing this, making it safe, putting up netting to make sure we investigate it well so that no one would be hurt by our building. My friends, it's powerful to me that our building itself is feeling the weight of what we are facing as a nation. So on this day in which it is clear things are falling apart, the church liturgical cycle hands us Trinity Sunday. Earlier this week, I was very tempted to ignore this focus, for it feels a whole lot more like Good Friday as we encounter the realities of executions and lynchings in our land. But on a very surface level, Trinity invites us to think in threes. Friends, we are facing three pandemics. COVID-19, Confederate COVID-16-19, the beginning of chattel slavery in this land, and climate change that exacerbates both of these COVIDs. Each of these are overwhelming, and I wonder if you're anything like me, feeling totally exhausted this week simply trying to keep up with the cascade of information everywhere you turn, trying to get a handle on reality, on what's happening, let alone the daily demands that continue in each of our lives. COVID-19 has now been in our collective sights for almost 3 months now. 111,000 deaths in our country, 293,000 more in other parts of our world. And even as our Commonwealth is poised to enter Phase 2 tomorrow, we remain committed to an altered daily existence of physical distancing and modified ways of being together, including church on Sunday mornings, in order to keep each other safe. And now we're having to deal with this scary reality that many of these prophetic protesters who have been gathering so courageously and faithfully in the streets, filling them, to change things are now potentially at risk of this first COVID. Of course, this second COVID-19, this viral racial injustice, has long soaked our land. And I want to show you something that reminded me of this week. To summarize this, I would say ugh is an apt description. This bag is from a store next to our building, an UGG store, which was ransacked at the tail end of the incredibly peaceful and prophetic protests. And it's a symbol for me of the racial injustice that is boiling up to a fever point, a breaking point, no longer able to be held back by social structures that already were long broken in our land. And this bag landed at the very footstep of our church building, that same one that is falling apart on some levels. Friends, this injustice of racial systemic sin is coming to our doorstep. Some of us may have been ignoring for far too long. Others of us, perhaps based on the color of our skin, have not had the choice to ignore this pandemic. Another example for me, closer to my own home here in Newton, this past Thursday, Becky Rowan and I joined in an incredibly powerful protest, one of the many that are happening throughout this week in all of our communities in Greater Boston. We lined the street with some 1,000 other neighbors. Both sides of the street, we knelt as others filled the street and stopped traffic. Many young people, people of all color and background here in our city, and took that tragically now iconic 8 minutes and 46 seconds in solidarity on a knee with the amount of time that it took for George Floyd to cry out, "I cannot breathe." In that solidarity, I was struck and moved. As we came home that night, I learned in the Boston Globe and other sources that Tim Duncan, a neighbor on our very street, a recent athletic director from Northeastern, had been stopped a week before George Floyd was no longer allowed to breathe because of police brutality. Tim Duncan, my neighbor, was stopped by 6 armed police officers in my own city, Progressive City, as we are known to tout, with one gun drawn, for the apparent crime of walking while black with his spouse to Whole Foods, simply because he fit a description of a murder suspect. This is far too often the experience of many of our friends and colleagues and common congregants of color in our nation. And the final symbol of this past week that brings us to the point of rage and lamentation is to look at our nation's capital. It's surreal seeing its militarized overreach to a response to peaceful protest. And of course, this horrific, heretical image of the occupant in the couldn't be more aptly named White House, further disgracing the office that he occupies by immorally occupying St. John's Episcopal Church as a mere backdrop from which he did not pray, toting a Bible from which he did not quote from, more callously ordering law enforcement to clear with force and tear gas a path through demonstrators who are peacefully gathering. Friends, this image should shock us as people who do tout our scriptures as sacred, who hold Christianity and the one named Jesus as central. To see a central figure in our nation abusing that faith for means of violence and domination and power should strike at our core and further, like an UGG bag, like a neighbor in our own street who is harassed, call us to action. I also, in the face of these powerful 3 difficult images, rejoice in the incredible images of these protests spreading not only now to every state in our country over these past 12 days and counting, but now across our planet, from London to Lagos, from Cape Town to Melbourne. Have you seen these images of international gatherings in solidarity with Black Lives Matter? There is growing momentum that I pray remains sustained as we face this pandemic. The third one, which exacerbates both of these 2 COVIDs, our Climate Jubilee team will be speaking more about today after our worship: climate change. Climate change which makes air harder to breathe, which leads to more severe COVID cases, far more frequently affecting people of color. We need to talk about this, and we need to figure out those connections so that we, as a people of faith, can hear the call of the Trinity God calling us into action. I'm grateful for our Climate Jubilee team. I'm grateful for our missional plan that was chosen and discerned by this community, this congregation, through lots of hard work and questions. We are in a good place to be poised to respond in these ways. So friends, as a world that is triply plagued right now, it can be exhausting. But it's important for us to take a grasp on reality, as Bonhoeffer called his people in the midst of that Nazi occupation, to call themselves as Christians back to reality, to remember what is happening, to remember these images, to name them, and also remember the reality of God in their midst. It feels insurmountable. The powers seem too great, but I wonder if this was the exact same question that the followers of Jesus, after his lynching, were asking. It seems insurmountable. The powers are far too great. This Roman occupation has the last word. What do we do now? Where do we go? How do we go forward without our center, without our leader? But I love that before leaving them, Jesus, as lifted up in Matthew's account today, gives them an invitation. We call it the Great Commission. Go and do something, he says. Go out and touch water. Get your hands wet. Be in relationship with the earth and with other. And with your wet hands, baptize. Reach out to others and let them know that they are named and beloved of God. Do not do so just in my name, Jesus says, but do it in the name of mystery. Do it in the name of a sacramental, mysterious process of baptism through the mysterious name of me as three. We now call Trinity. In the face of that which scares you, go out and touch the earth, get wet, and anoint others with this message of radical welcoming of all people across the globe. All reflect the image of God through this mysterious grace that is far more powerful than your comprehension. You'll never understand it fully, as the Reformers later amplified. But do so, and remember that I am with you always to the end of the age. This is Jesus' great commission to the disciples, to go out in the midst of that which scares them. So friends, I wonder, with these questions that have been deeply consuming us this week, in the unsettledness that definitely feels different, at least to me and I think to many of us, than times before, that if perhaps the question before us is to think about what is the invitation of this Trinitarian, mysterious sending forth God. We remember that this image of Trinity did not come out of Scripture. It does not come out of the Bible. It's never named as such, but we hear hints of it in today's Scripture accounts. But it was a construct that was brought together over the first few decades and centuries, all the way up into the 300s, until it was made official, of the early Christian followers, of trying to get a good sense as to who God is. And they landed on this idea of Trinity, God in relationship, perichoresis, this idea of constant flow of connection. God not just as Father or Mother or Creator, God not just as a limited one who walked this earth as a Palestinian in one place and one time, not just as a Spirit, as advocate, as counsel, as she, but God as all three. God as linked together, God as in motion, moving forward in relationship constantly. And I love that this theological idea was an innovation for the first followers of Jesus. Into the faces of continued imperial oppression and then state sanction in the 300s, but probably in a militarized way, putting the cross on shields, as Constantine did, there was continued questions as to how to be the followers of God, where to be in what spaces. And this theological innovation sent people forward into a new way. I wonder, friends, what new Trinitarian concept we might be paying attention to as we look at the landscape of these three pandemics in our land. There are three simple images I want to lift up because I think taking stock of reality really matters in these days. It's easy to get overwhelmed, but these three have spoken deeply to me. In DC again, when nonviolent protesters were being kettled in by police on Tuesday night, or Monday night, I believe, into a dead end, being tear gassed and about to be arrested. Did you see this? Local residents like Raoul Dubé flung wide their doors and allowed some 100 strangers into their apartments and kept them, fed them, gave milk to their eyes as their tears flowed from the tear gas until the curfew ended the next day. This radical opening, this radical welcoming is an image for us to lift up. 2, the toppling of Confederate monuments across our country. We've seen one in Birmingham already, a 52-foot tall granite obelisk taken down. And next, in Richmond, Virginia, Governor Ralph Northam has announced they would finally topple that 130-year-old statue of Robert E. Lee, which has long, on that intimidating horseback, has long been used to intimidate and bring white supremacy to a visual forefront. Finally, back to DC, this renaming of Lafayette Square to Black Lives Matter Square. Friends, these things matter, and how we name things, how we speak about things matter. And I wonder if we are invited to see a new Trinity in our world today, looking for examples of a new social order that could spring up out of what many consider to be chaos. But in the eyes of Dr. King and so many others, chaos or rioting, which is truly the voice of the unheard. May we listen to these voices. May we look in our own congregation and hear of Anita Graham, who's going to gather this afternoon with many other musicians, socially distanced, but playing together to bring music into a parking lot and record it for others to hear. Let's look at our newsletters and see, again, of Christine and Guy's creative wedding, socially distanced, but bringing love together in an incredible way up there in Vermont. Let's remember Salam and Emily raising their daughters in the midst of Emily as an ER doctor, continuing to selflessly serve those sick with COVID-19. Let us remember rain in Nicaragua. Let us remember last week's worship service where our young people, our prophetic voices led us and transformed all of our hearts in the beginning of these hard pandemic feelings that we've been leaning into. Friends, I would invite us to continue to listen to the voice of emergence of the Spirit. Think about new innovative theological ideas like Trinity that may transport us to see about and think about God as relationship, and we as people desperately needing to be connected to one another right now being moved out into our world. And so the question to me as things fall apart is, what are we being asked to catch? What details, what specifics, as we look at the Roxbury pudding stone that fell from the steeple? If we look carefully, we remember a few things. Roxbury, the heart of Boston in many ways. We remember some of the racial injustices, the redlining that's taken place in Mattapan and Roxbury, and we're called together as one. And we remember our geological training that a pudding stone is truly a conglomerate. It's a coming together of radical difference in one rock to bring beauty to the world. So friends, as we repair that steeple, as we look to the things that we catch that are falling apart, may we rebuild together lasting institutions, lasting images, lasting innovative concepts, and a new social order, not only here in our community of faith, but as part of the wider work in our city, in our nation in these days. May God be with us. God is three. Amen.